Madam Assistant Secretary, let's start off with the big picture. As sort of the person in charge of OCR, what is OCR meant? Why do you collect the data, and what is it supposed to accomplish?
The Office for Civil Rights has been charged by Congress now for decades to enforce federal civil rights laws in schools. Our original charge was to enforce federal law against race discrimination in school, and since then Congress has added to our jurisdiction laws against sex discrimination, disability discrimination, age discrimination, and the Boy Scouts of America Act. And it's our job to make sure that every student in every school community nationwide experiences the civil rights protection that Congress has promised to our entire nation. And that means that we have 12 offices offices all over the country, and investigators all over the country whose job it is to receive complaints, take in information about school communities, and ensure full civil rights satisfaction as Congress has promised it. We have, since 1968, collected civil rights data in school. We have a specific statutory charge to make sure that we have data that helps us to assess whether civil rights are satisfied in school. And we ask from every school community, P12, all across the country, about the experiences of students with respect to high rigor course access, teacher preparation, attendance, courses that are offered, incidents of restraint and seclusion, incidents of discipline in schools, a wide variety of civil rights indicators that help us to know whether we have more information that we should be seeking. And then we have, in recent years, been sharing that information externally as well. So it's both for us to use, but also for school communities to use to assess whether civil rights are satisfied, and to identify flags and concerns that school communities and we may want to examine further.
Couple of layers of the onion to pull back, but let's stay basic for a minute. This is every 2 years you collect this data directly from the schools. Talk to me about that.
Typically, since 1968, we've collected the data every 2 years. This is actually the first time in the COVID context that we're collecting it 2 years in a row. And the reason there is to make sure that we have specific information about the ways that the pandemic has impacted school communities, and that we have a timely, useful lens on the experiences of students in this context.
And you have a return rate of, I think, over 90-something%, almost 98% was the last I remember. That's pretty good.
We have a very high return rate. I will say that it is a statutory requirement for school communities to share the data with us. So if they don't, they're in violation of federal law. So that does help with the return rate, and also we are very aggressive with school communities in our support for ensuring they know that we would like their data, and that we go back and we ask them to share it with us if they don't.
When can the public expect to see this data? Because the latest data is 2017-2018, which I'm going to talk to you here in about, which you know that's why we're here. But sure. When do we expect to see the latest data?
We don't have a projected date right now for it, but we're hoping that we'll see it in this school year, able to be produced. We just closed the data collection, so now we are doing the cleanup and the work to make sure that the nearly 17,000 school districts around the country actually have completed the data, and that the data is clean enough for us to be able to produce.
So it's sort of a two-part question. Actually, it's the same question for two angles. One, what can you, DOE, do about schools that don't comply if they're in violation? And two, I should ask this later, but I'll trust you to answer it both times. If you find violations or problems or identify issues, how far can you go? I mean, we talk about independent school districts. What can DOE do about it? Let's start with if they don't comply.
And just so I'm clear, if you're asking if they don't comply with the data reporting,
data, right.
Well, we first let them know that we would like them to share the data. So we try to get it. Sometimes it's an oversight. Sometimes there's a mistake. So we treat with kid gloves first to ask to have the data, and typically that means we then get it. If we, after going back and reminding a school community that they haven't turned in the data, that we don't have it and we still need it, then we send them a letter to remind them again, and ultimately we can put them on, for example, high-risk status so that they become ineligible to receive grants of federal funds. We have a variety of tools that we can use to encourage and incent the compliance. And
you can withhold federal funds when it comes to the bottom line.
At the end of the day, we can withhold federal funds.
All right, so now I've got a school system and I look at it, I'm you, and I go, oh, this school system is all kinds of discriminatory. How do does all kinds of, how do you bring them back into a more acceptable posture? Do you have tools, or can they just say, hey, we're independent, we'll do what we want?
Well, as a condition of receiving federal funds, our school communities commit to the federal government that they will satisfy their federal civil rights obligations. So that is a congressional charge that we have been enforcing right along for decades, and that enforcement tool has proven quite effective over time. The good news is school communities typically are trying to comply with the law. They're trying to make sure that their students' civil rights are satisfied. And when we identify concerns, they typically come into compliance and do the right thing. To be very clear, data is never alone enough to identify a civil rights violation. The data can raise concerns. We look underneath the data to evaluate whether the disparities are justified or not justified, and whether change needs to be made. And so the data is a crucial tool for us and also for school communities, and it's not in itself an indicator of civil rights violation.
I want to read from this new guidance that was put out in July that new resources reflect the concern, particularly in the light of the prevalence of student mental health issues associated with the pandemic, that some students with disabilities are not receiving the support and services necessary to address their educational needs, including their disability-based behavior, talking about discipline in this case. When we mine down into the data that you all put out, 2017, 2018, which was pre-pandemic, we found disparities when it came to both referrals and arrest of disability students, disabled students, and students of black students in particular, but students of color. Is that acceptable in your mind?
It's a deep, deep concern for all of us, and it has been over a distressingly long period of time, that we see students with disabilities disproportionately referred to law enforcement. We see students of color disproportionately referred to law enforcement. And we ask school communities to examine that data. We examine that data ourselves to identify whether there's a civil rights violation. But I will say to you, as a mom, and as the chief civil rights enforcer in schools, it is deeply distressing to me to see that there are students who are treated differently in school, and it looks like they're treated differently because of who they are.
By law enforcement in many cases.
Often by law enforcement. Not
SROs.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just mine down to it. That's who
Sure.
we're talking about.
Well,
for
it
the
is and
most
it
part.
isn't. It is a frequent concern that SROs are involved in ways that are discriminatory in school, and that's a concern that we've spoken to multiple times here at the Department of Education to try to ensure that our school communities are aware and are taking the steps that they need to take to make sure that students are appropriately treated. It's not exclusively law enforcement. And from the civil rights lens, I'm concerned every time any child is harmed by anyone.
I hear you, but we're focusing on SROs because it's clear, right? And we did the data, used your data, found 715 fifth graders or younger arrested, not referred, arrested in 2017-20. Madam Secretary, I have to ask, is it ever acceptable to arrest a 7-year-old?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, I think it's infrequently acceptable to arrest a 7-year-old, but there are times when that is a warranted law enforcement response. So the important message for school communities is that should be isolated. That should not be the norm. That should not be the way we expect to treat our students. And if you find yourself there as a school community, you should be evaluating hard whether you needed to and what steps you can take to make sure you don't find yourself there again.
Is there more DOE can do to minimize this, to stop this?
Well,
are you doing enough?
You're never doing enough if a child is harmed, right? So we always have the fire in the belly. All of the civil rights investigators in my office have the fire in the belly to make sure that every child is treated the way that we would want the person we love the most in the world to be treated. And we've taken very aggressive steps on this topic because this is so important and because its repetition is so extreme. But in 2012, the Department of Education issued guidance recommending that school communities never use restraint or seclusion. In 2016, and then again just last July, we issued guidance where we explained that school communities are responsible for the actions of law enforcement officers. They are responsible for the actions of school resource officers that they employ and that they contract with in their schools, and that the civil rights obligation extends to them. We also were very clear about the circumstances under which the use of restraint and seclusion can violate federal civil rights laws with respect to students with disabilities, and we have engaged in aggressive enforcement. We received complaints that we investigate on this topic. We opened 24 compliance reviews on the topic in 2019, and we've been publicizing the resolution agreements to make sure that we're sharing information with school communities about what we expect and what we want done for students. And the violations persist, and that's a deep concern, right? That is, it's horrifying to imagine any child ever treated in a way that is inconsistent with what Congress commands for every school.
You read my mind. It still happens. Why does it keep happening?
Every year is a new opportunity to harm a child. I wish that weren't true, but every year we have new children who start in schools. Every year we have change in school communities, and there are so many things that happen in a school day in front of school communities, so many different behaviors that take place in school, so many different situations that can come up in a school day, that there are unfortunately legion opportunities for discrimination to exist. What we do as a nation is to set clear guardrails, set clear promises, and then do the hard spade work to be there every time to make sure that we redress when discrimination takes place, we help school communities heal, and we send a clear message about what our expectations are to minimize the circumstances under which that takes place.
But is that enough? 715 children arrested.
Let me say, any harm to any child, anywhere, that violates federal civil rights law is a travesty. It is never acceptable for that to happen. And our Congress has promised us that no person shall be discriminated against in school. My job every day is to address that and to help our school communities come as close as they possibly can to fulfilling that responsibility. And when they don't, to take the steps that they need to take to correct it.
There's some research by the University of Delaware, Florida, University of Florida, I believe UNC Wilmington, that says SROs, by their mere presence, create more referrals and arrests just because they're there. There is a segment critics who say SROs shouldn't be in school, especially elementary school. And yet, just across the river is a state that the governor ran on the platform, an SRO in every school. Should SROs be in every school in America?
The local school communities make choices about the best ways to protect education in their communities. We have federal civil rights guardrails that are a stopgap against harm. That stopgap against harm says no matter whom you employ, no matter whom you contract with in your school community, you school community must make sure that every single adult in that community treats every single child in that community with respect and dignity and does not discriminate. So if a school community chooses to employ SROs, that's their choice. But if they do it, they have to make sure that the SROs, like anybody else in that school building, protects children.
It's probably not going to surprise you. Your data shows that state, Virginia, has the highest rate of arrest of elementary school students. Does that surprise you?
Well, it doesn't surprise me because I know the data, but
you probably know better than I do. How do you fix this? Again, other than withholding funding, does DOE have enough tools to stop this from happening again and again?
I find the tools that Congress has given us, the tools that we have, enormously powerful. They've been very effective over time. And if anybody's civil rights are violated, ever, they don't get that time back. Children don't get their life back before they were discriminated against. And our school communities every day are sending messages to students. They're sending messages about their worth, their dignity, government belief in them. So when we exclude a child, when we send a child to law enforcement, we are sending a very deleterious governmental message. That's scary. I want very much for that to be minimized and for it to take place only in those circumstances where it's absolutely necessary.
You're extremely smart, probably smartest one in the room by far, so I don't want to be pandering, but Virginia also puts all their SROs in the U.S. Virginia Department of Justice. Every other state we can find puts it under education. Is that causing this inordinate amount of arrest? Because Virginia approaches it differently.
Well,
in other words, they're not under education, they're under justice. So their job is to arrest people.
Yes. The job of anyone who is operating in a school community, regardless of who their immediate boss is, the job of anybody who is operating a school community is to educate students, is to protect civil rights of students, is to be part of an inclusive school community that supports students' learning, period. Is there one reason why Virginia is an outlier? I doubt it. There are lots of ways that Virginia is different from other states with respect to referring students to school arrests. Should Virginia take a hard look at that question and take a hard look at the choices that they are making as a state about the messages that they want to send to their children? Absolutely. Is it my job to make sure that the children in Virginia, just like the children in Kentucky, just like the children in Maryland, just like the children in California, are fully protected? Yes, it is.
Where do you see this going? I did see the trend, and overall it's down a little bit, but it's still the hundreds. Maybe not 715, but maybe it was 750 the year before or 2 years before. Are we making progress, or are we not making progress fast enough? Is it acceptable to have all these children continue to be arrested?
Well, both things are true. Yes, we are making progress as a country. Yes, we are thinking hard as a country about whether and when we restrain and seclude children and how we support children in school. And it is never, ever enough progress if a child is harmed, because from that child's perspective, that child's rights weren't satisfied. So I am a both and person on this. I am delighted that we are in the national conversation about use of restraint and seclusion, that we are in the national conversation about how best to educate and support students in schools. And I am enormously distressed about anyone's loss of civil rights satisfaction.
If you will indulge me, I know you're a parent, and I'm a parent. I'd like you to watch this video from North Carolina, from
You're gonna make me
Statesville. I
cry.
bet you. Well, I cry when I see it, and the superintendent of this school system. And I just want your visceral mother and assistant secretary reaction to it. This is a 7-year-old autistic child.
All right.
You've probably seen it.
Okay, I got him. He's good. He's mine now. Ma'am, may I? Thank you. Come here. Oops, sorry. Watch your arm. All right, don't move. You spit on me, I'll put a hood on you. You can't bully your way through this, dude. Put it in front of his face. Thank you. Turn your head to the side. Thank you. Can you breathe? Good. You ever been charged before? Okay, well, you're fixing to. How old are you? How old are you? Don't make a wrong move. Period. Just chill out. He's a spit on manners. I'm not playing that game. I don't do the spitting. I don't mind the walking. I don't mind the occasional shove. But you don't spit here. He's going to get charged. So, if you, my friend, are not acquainted with the juvenile justice system, you will be very shortly.
If you're not acquainted with the juvenile justice system, you will be shortly. 7-year-old autistic child. Is that acceptable in your mind?
There's very little that I saw in that video that is acceptable. And there's very little that I saw in that video that is consistent with federal civil rights obligations. I was not an adult who is exercising training if the adult had been trained in the ways to work with the child and the ways to de-escalate a situation. So it was an enormously distressing video.
As a mom, what's your reaction?
My reaction to what I saw in this video is my reaction to what I see over and over and over again in our investigations, where there is a child who's forever harmed by the adult interaction with that child and by the message from the school community. And there are a handful of cases that we investigate that I will never forget, and this video is in that category.
For spitting?
Well,
I mean, he doesn't have an M16. He's not going in going to shoot up the school. He got frustrated. His dad had just died, and he spit. And
I'm just to be very clear, spitting is a disability-based behavior. So,
absolutely.
And the federal law is that we don't discriminate against students for engaging in disability-based behavior. It's that simple.